Good to see everybody this morning, to our attendance to our Bible class. It's always good to see visitors too with us. I see some, they're really not visitors, but traveling preachers today. We have several with us, Connor and Tori. Good to see y'all, and hope to get to speak to you before you leave. I missed you a while ago, so good to see y'all here from Colorado, and Connor preaches there, and they're in for a birthday, I heard. Okay. And it's good to see our visiting preacher with us today. Brother Shane Riddle comes to us from Florence. Just moved there just a few hours ago, but he has been down in Walker County for a couple of years, and we'll have a little more on his introduction in a little bit, but we're happy to have him with us here today, and he's going to conduct a Bible class for us, and then we'll have our worship service, and of course then again this evening at 5. So we're happy to have Brother Shane with us, and he does have folks in Florence, I believe he said, so I'll give a better introduction here in just a little bit right before our worship service, so we'll not take up much more of his time. We're running just a little bit late anyway, but let's have a word of prayer before we begin. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this Lord's Day that we have another privilege and blessing and opportunity to assemble here together to study from thy word. We're so thankful for thy word, the power of it, that we are able to freely study it and apply it to our lives and help others learn more of thy will. We ask thee to be with us in our Bible class here this morning, be with Brother Shane as he has prepared this lesson for us. We're thankful for him. We ask thy blessing be upon him and his family, and we pray for the work of the church wherever it is, all faithful brethren. We pray for those who need thy gospel. We pray for time that we can reach those round about us here and other places, and ask thy blessing to be upon the work of the church. And we're so thankful for Jesus and his sacrifice for us, and that we have all these spiritual blessings, and we are mindful of ourselves, and we ask thee to forgive us, Father. We know we do things sometimes that we shouldn't. We omit things, and we pray that you would be with us and forgive us. And all these things we do ask in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, Brother Shane has his family with us, and I'll go ahead and give y'all a little heads up. Andrea, Jeannie is his wife, is that right? Gina is his wife, Andrea, the daughter, Colt is their son. So y'all got a heads up on that. We'll get you again.
It's working? We're good? Okay, I hear it. Good. I believe in openness, so I'm going to tell you up front, this is the most nerve-wracking part of speaking somewhere else for me. I don't know why, but adult Bible class always just freaks me out way more than preaching or meeting people or anything else. I'm so nervous I'm going to get up here and do a class that y'all just had last Sunday or just had last Wednesday or something that the last preacher, it was his favorite thing to talk about or whatever. So then I get 2 or 3 things ready, and then I'm nervous because I have 2 or 3 things that I sort of know and not one that I really got ready. So y'all bear with me here. I also don't know how you like to do things, how you normally do things. I usually believe in a lot of discussion in Bible class, which I hope you'll be willing to do. I spoke somewhere about a year ago. I spoke at a church, and I was doing their Bible class, and I asked them, I said, how did the walls of Jericho actually fall down? And they just looked at me, and then I was like, no, I want to know what you think. And then they still just looked at me because they weren't used to that. So hopefully, if you'll bear with me on this and give me some feedback, that'll help. So my first question for you is, how did the walls of Jericho actually fall down? God knocked them down? See, I love this version of the story, and honestly, I would probably argue that's the case. My question for you is, where does it say that? Sorry?
We know it because they shouted. After they shouted, the walls fell down. God told them what to do to mark around the walls of Jericho 7 times, blow the trumpet, and then they shout.
And then they fell down when they did what he said, right? So what we do is we say, okay, God said do this, the walls fall, they did it, the walls fell, God must have knocked them down. But does it say that God knocked them down? It says by faith, but is that the faith of the action, that because the action they did, God reached down and knocked them down himself? Or is it because God knew a way that what they did could knock the walls down? And so when they followed him, their faith led to the walls going down. Because it doesn't actually say that God reached down and knocked the walls down. And again, I think that's probably what happened. I love that version of the story. But something that's really cool there is what we've done is we've taken this little assumption, which is not necessarily bad. We've taken an assumption. We treat it like we know. When the truth is we don't actually know how they came down. There's this really cool thing, this pulse theory. It's the idea that of what vibrations can do. Did you know that the act of the marching and the sound from the trumpets and all of that could have brought the walls down? Could have shaken them loose to the point where they eventually fell down. Does that take away from the miracle of the story? No. Why? Because God still told them exactly when it would happen, and because, I'll be honest with you, in Joshua's time, they probably didn't know very much about pulse theory, okay? So I'm not trying to say there's not a miracle in the story. What I am saying is, it's hard for us to study when we skip over things or when we assume things. I think it's very easy for us to read things and accept them the way that we heard them in Vacation Bible School 10, 20 years ago, whatever the case may be.
That really wasn't an assumption, it was more of an implication.
Well, you can take it as an implication. You can take it as, and I would say we would use it as an inference. We make the inference that, right? What I'm saying is we take things that aren't directly stated, and then we teach them to children. We say, hey, this is how it happened, and God knocked the walls down, and we mean it however we mean it, but they take it as it being literal, and we don't ever move past that inference. We don't ever study more into what it is. I would say that it's an even cooler miracle for God to be able to tell them the exact moment the walls would come down, whether or not he's the one that knocked them down. I would say it's really interesting that God took something that could have been scientific or could have been a miracle, but either way, at the end of the story, we know the power that brought the walls down was still God. So I'm not trying to take away from the story. I would also say, if you want to use an example, this is something that I taught this in a teen class one time. I was talking about it, and one of the teens brought it up. And he asked, okay, well, if you want to break down Bible stories, did God bring the big fish to swallow Jonah? I was like, well, that's a good question. I don't know. Is the miracle that God summoned the fish? Because it doesn't say that. Or is the miracle that God kept the fish from swallowing Jonah? We don't know. I've heard it taught that the fish came just because God wanted it to. I've heard it taught that God kept the fish from eating Jonah. But either way, we don't know where the actual miracle in the story is. All we do know is that there was God's power. What I'm afraid of is we take not just situations like that, but we take other cases throughout the Bible, and we take the assumptions or the inferences, we take the things from it that we don't know for sure, and we treat them as being sure. And when we do that, it's really easy for someone that disagrees with us to try to break it down. Another good example of that is if you want to say, okay, baptism. Obviously, I believe that we have to be baptized to be saved. But I also met a teen, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I met a teenager who I asked him why he had to be baptized, and his only answer was because we're supposed to be. Because he didn't have the full story behind what he was supposed to do, he couldn't defend his belief, right? What I want to say is we have to break down the assumptions and the barriers to what we're trying to teach people, what we're trying to explain as the truth, so that they can't poke holes in it. I've in the last 2 or 3 years, come into this real love tying other, I don't say tying other subjects into the Bible, but seeing how other subjects relate to the Bible. Tying philosophy or logic or science into where it's in the Bible. Showing how the Bible supports these things or how it actually proves certain things. For example, I love the psychology in the Bible. My wife, sorry, she's heard me talk about this before. She's probably getting tired of it. But I love the fact that the Bible is laid out in such a way that it can read like a novel, or it could read like psychology, or it could read like philosophy. And there's all these different ways we can break it down and look at it that don't change the message of the Bible. I think that's pretty neat. For example, have y'all ever talked about persuasive styles of speech, like the Greek philosophy styles of speech? Ethos, pathos, logos. Have y'all talked about those? I don't want to go over it if you have, but okay. Well, thank you. That's encouraging. Thank you. Okay. So my favorite, of course, is logos. Logos is the idea of reasoning. It's the idea of logic and reasoning, right? It's the idea of breaking things down in an objective way to show how you reach a certain conclusion that is true. The problem is that there's three other ways to do it. There's pathos, which is emotion. There's ethos, which is credibility. And there's kairos, which is urgency. Okay? Now I'm going to start with urgency because it's not as common in the Bible. You don't really see it as much in the Bible directly. What you do see a lot is we see that in our world now, where they treat something like it has to be addressed right now, but even if they can't break down why or how important it is. And I'm not going to get any political issues, but usually politics is where you see this. They say, hey, this is something that we've got to deal with today. We have to do this right now. No matter what else is going on, we have to stop everything and deal with this right now. That's kairos. It's you try to convince somebody of something by addressing just the urgency of it. Again, going back to baptism, urgency isn't always bad. We need to be baptized. We need to be baptized as soon as we understand it and can do it correctly. But the flip side of that is what drives me nuts is when I have someone say, hey, I want to be baptized, but can I wait a couple of weeks till so-and-so can be here? If you get to the point where you know that there's one step you've got to take to reach salvation, but you want to wait 2 weeks, do you really understand the urgency? Probably not. I hope nobody minds me saying that. I'm not trying to be harsh or anything, but I hear, especially working with teenagers as long as I have, I used to hear that all the time. Oh, I want to get baptized, but I want to wait until. And then I'd say, well, maybe we need to study it a little bit more then. And then people sometimes get mad at me for saying that. My point is the urgency side is wrong if that's how we argue something. If all we do is just address the urgency, we don't get the whole story. So maybe we go to ethos, which is credibility. I can't get up here and tell you exactly what God thinks about something. I don't actually have that credibility. The advantage that Christians have over other people is that Jesus did have the credibility. Jesus did have the authority to be the one to say, this is what God expects of you. So when Jesus said that the two laws are love God and love your neighbor, then we can't argue that because he has that ethos. But if I came up to you and I said, oh, well, God summoned the fish to swallow Jonah and then kept it from swallowing Jonah and then told the fish when to spit Jonah out. And then when Jonah went to Nineveh and was preaching to him, God told him exactly what to say. I don't have the ethos to give you that argument because I don't know all of those details. So what I have to do is I can only teach you what I do have the credibility to teach. And again, we have the advantage of our credibility comes from God who is always going to be right. So we have an advantage. And then last is pathos. And this is the one that you'll see the most today. This is the emotional argument. This is either I either give the argument emotionally or I try to get an emotional response from you. Either way. So again, if you go back to politics, you'll see this a lot. It's either where you use personal attacks or emotional arguments to try to be convincing as opposed to actually breaking down the argument. So my next question for you is, do you see pathos arguments in the Bible where they address emotion in some way, either from you or from yes, okay. So I'm a little bit deaf. I thought that's what you said. I just wanted to make sure. Yes, okay. Now, first glance, you might say, talking about taxes is not an emotional argument, but why would you bring up paying taxes with someone? Especially in times like today or then where taxes were such a hot topic. Because nobody wants to talk about it, right? It makes you angry. It makes you upset to talk about it. So what they're doing is they're bringing up something that's emotionally charged in the hope that if they bring up the emotionally charged argument and Jesus gives the wrong answer, then he's going to lose way more people than if he just gives an answer that they don't agree with. They're using those emotions to try to cater, right? What's another good example of an emotional argument?
Well, most all the things that are emotional then were political things of us today.
Right.
Get somebody all riled up and start talking politics.
Which I promise I'm gonna try not to do that.
That's what they did to Christ.
They did.
Him politically.
Right, and the reason they do that, again, is not just the emotional charge, but also because they could do the same thing then that people do now of we have to address this right now, right? Oh, these taxes are getting so high we can't afford them anymore. We have to talk about this now. Even if really there are more important things to talk about, right? Like salvation, like the Messiah who was here, or the teachings of the apostles who were trying to straighten out the first century church and get them on the right track from the beginning. There were more important things to talk about. But they're leaning towards arguments that aren't actually about Scripture or about what's necessary for salvation. So what happens is if you don't balance your arguments, it pulls you away from the track you're supposed to be on, right? So here's the problem I have with this philosophy side of how to argue the Bible. Is you'll hear preachers, ministers, teachers, whatever say that you have to do everything a very specific way. There's this one way that you have to do it. The problem with that is that's not accurate. If I talk to you about baptism all day, everybody I ever meet, I talk to them about baptism, and I teach them using only logic and reasoning, then I will not say anything that's not right. But what I might do is not be able to reach the ones who are more persuaded by emotional arguments. Now, I shouldn't only tell them the emotional things. I shouldn't only give them emotionally charged arguments, but I do have to have that balance. In the same way that I've got to bring in kairos. If I'm telling them about baptism and I think they understand and I've got them at the level of knowledge and emotional understanding, but I don't impress upon them that it has to be done as soon as they can necessarily do it, then I'm still going to be the one messing up, right? We have to balance the philosophy of how we argue the Bible. So I feel like I'm talking almost entirely to them, but I don't mean to do that. I took preparation and delivery of sermons at Freed, and in my class when I did it, the professor said that I only talked to one side of the room. So if I start doing that, feel free to tell me to move over. It won't hurt my feelings. Anyways, so we have to balance our three arguments. So that's when you get into how do you argue the Bible with philosophy? So then I could ask you the question of, okay, what's the first sin that David committed with Bathsheba? As in the story, not necessarily with her. What's the first sin he committed? Lust, or when he looked at her, are those the same thing? Because what did David probably know about Bathsheba? Did you know that in their culture at this time that bathing on top of the house was not unheard of? Why? Because if you're in houses that are somewhat open, where do you go for privacy? The place that's not at street level, right? You go up. Okay? So David may have already known that that's where she bathed. And he's still up there wandering around. Now, I'm not saying, again, I'm not trying to make an implication that it's not there like I just said not to do. What I'm saying is if I'm teaching that story, and the first thing I say is, the first thing David did wrong was look at Bathsheba, I may already be wrong. And someone who knows their history and their Jewish culture better than I do can point that out. So instead of being able to give every detail of a story, and assume every detail of a story, if we really want to study something and teach it accurately, we have to make sure that our study is accurate. We've got to make sure that we bring in the philosophical ties, the philosophical views. We have to understand that when we look at something, we can explain the science of it in a scientific way. It takes so much more than just the stories we hear at Vacation Bible School and from preachers and everything else. We have to study the details and understand which parts of the stories we actually know in order to be able to teach it correctly and not have somebody poke holes in it. Sorry? Yes. Wandering around on rooftops, surrounded by wives whose husbands weren't home. Again, I'm not trying to say that's what happened, but when you understand that part of the history and culture, it tells you that maybe there's more to the story that we don't know, so we can't say like we do. We are. Well, I'll say this. I love debate. Probably a little bit too much. I love debate. When I was at Freed, one of the things I used to do is because I was a little bit older, I think, not necessarily because I'm claiming to be all that smart, but some of the other students that were taking classes where they had to debate each other or debate a professor, they would come and practice against me. And so I would run into these kind of speculation arguments. And one of the things that came up is in one of the classes, the students' debate was on David and whether or not Bathsheba was the only time that happened, based off of things like, that's a good plan to have Uriah come back. But also maybe it was the first time because he didn't really recognize the wrong of what he did till after someone explained it to him. So it was probably the first time. So those kind of speculative back and forth, I do enjoy those. But also, if you study that way, you start to realize how much you've always assumed or taught that you didn't really know. So if I want to say, going back to the walls of Jericho, if I want to say that Pulse theory tells you that the walls would fall down and would fall down a certain way, I don't actually know the science behind that as well as I would like to. What I can tell you is there's something really cool in the story of the walls of Jericho and how they fell that I read over 100 times before someone else pointed out to me. It says the walls fell flat, right? But Jericho's up on a hill. So the word there for flat, that means level. How does something fall level if it falls on a hillside? Seems like an irrelevant point at first, but what's cool about that is it probably means, according to a Hebrew scholar who's much smarter than I am, it probably means that every piece of the walls was touching the ground. Like they fell down so completely that there was nothing left stacked on top of each other. That's the idea of flat or level, is that everything was touching the ground, which would have made it really easy for what? The invasion they were trying to have. And what's cool about that is, if it was pulse theory, it probably wouldn't fall that way. I don't know how much you know about the walls of Jericho, but they were only 20 or 25 feet high, which doesn't sound that high to us, but back then that was pretty high. And being on top of a hillside, that gave them a huge advantage. And the walls were so thick that they had apartments in them. They had people that could live in the walls. But the walls came down so completely that the entirety of the walls touched the ground. That is an implication of something much stronger than pulse theory, just shaking it apart into a few pieces. That's an implication that something much stronger and more powerful took down those walls. So once you get into the study and you realize what you don't know, maybe you can figure out the answers to what you didn't know. Gina's probably tired of me harping on this, but it's something I've always said. What bugs me to death about the way that I used to teach, or what I hear some people do when they teach, is when you don't give the whole picture, you give a picture full of holes. You may not have actually heard me say it that way. I think I just heard that one recently, but I really like it. Okay? If you don't have a picture, the whole picture when you give it to someone, then you have a picture that they can poke holes in. So if I want to go to something as simple as baptism, then I can't just say, hey, you've got to be baptized. Baptism is where you go underwater, and when you come back up, your sins are removed. Is that the whole story? No. What you need to do is you've got to say, hey, this also represents the most important moment in our history. This is representative of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, which is why the crucifixion mattered, why his teaching beforehand mattered, why him fulfilling all the prophecies mattered. Baptism is so much bigger than just being dunked in water. And maybe explaining it that way will not only help us reach people that haven't been baptized, it also might help us teach younger folks who are going to grow up and have to answer that question for somebody someday. One of the scariest things to me is when I get questions all the time from former students, or not former students of mine, but former fellow students at Freed, from teens I talk and say, hey, somebody asked me this and I don't have an answer. And I'll think, man, I know I taught you that. And I know that when I taught you that, I wonder if I did a bad job. When someone says, hey, why can't we have instruments in the church? And then I'll send them this big, long response. It'll be on Facebook. It'll be this long, like this big, long response. And then they'll say, oh, well, somebody else just said, well, there's this verse that says we have to sing, so it doesn't say we play. But you can't make a full argument off of saying the Bible says sing, so we can't do anything else. Because then where do you draw the line? If I say that the only thing we have to do as far as singing praise, the only authority we have to do is to sing, then where do songbooks, PowerPoint, everything else come from? Where's the song leader come from? We have to be able to give them the whole argument of the authority we have is to sing together, and we don't have the authority to add something that's not part of the singing, right? You've got to explain it in the complete way so that you can tell them where the line is and no one pokes those holes in it. I have a friend from this area who was out of the church for, that had to have been 9 or 10 years. And one of the things that always bugged me, I would talk to him and I'd study with him. He's just now come back to the church, and one of the things is he would say stuff like that. He'd say, yeah, I know it says sing, but it doesn't say we can't play. I know it says we have to be baptized, but it doesn't say immersion. I know it says that we have to assemble for the sake of encouraging each other, but it doesn't say that we have to assemble every time there's a chance to assemble. So what I have to do is I have to break down each of these arguments for him so that I can teach him the whole picture. And once I help him understand the whole picture, then maybe he'll stop having his friends poke holes in it and he'll understand.
In that same mindset, we don't have to be historians to be Christians.
Right.
But boy, don't it make us stronger Christians when we understand the history of it. Like there's passages in the New Testament you cannot comprehend until you have an Old Testament foundation. So baptism is one of those things. It was Old Testament. Those Jews knew exactly what imagery was being used for them because they had tools all over the place. They knew that. It was just something came by Christ for remission sin, not ceremonially cleansing. Well, I think you can teach the whole background of that.
The whole piece of it, yes.
And exactly what you're saying. You don't have to be a historian to be a Christian, but it changes your perception of those commands when you understand them.
You got ahead of me a little bit. No, but in a good way, because you said that probably better than I think I was going to. If you'll notice earlier when I said some of the things that I enjoy tying to the Bible, I didn't mention history because I don't enjoy history, just being honest with you. I've never been a history buff. I didn't even get into the church until I was 12, so I missed a lot of Old Testament because it seems like that's where the focus is for the Old Testament. Is you teach it in the vacation Bible school age, and then you kind of miss it for the teenage years, and then you start learning it as an adult. But at that point, I was already preaching and teaching, so I was still kind of missing it. So that's hard for me. Tying in the history of the Old Testament and the Jewish culture, that's something I have to study constantly and try to understand. Right? But you're right. You don't have to be a full historian. What you do have to do is have the understanding, the ability to find it, okay? Which comes with the study. So things like philosophy that I do enjoy, logic, science, the things that I like to tie into the Bible, those are things that help make the whole picture. But I'll say this, Jewish culture, up as far as understanding the Bible, that's probably the biggest one. Okay? If you can get the point, I'll probably never be there. But a preacher friend of mine, it's really fun because what he'll do is we'll study together sometimes over Zoom or sometimes just message back and forth while we study. And without any footnotes or references or anything in his Bible, he'll get to something that's an Old Testament quote and he can tell me where it's from and the context around it. That's awesome. That level of not just knowledge of the Old Testament, but the level of study and understanding of how the Old Testament's tied to the New Testament and the references in it, that's incredible. And that's got to be the biggest help you can have for studying the Bible. But I don't think I'll ever get to the point he's at. He's also just much smarter than I am, so that doesn't hurt. He's got a PhD. So I guess what I'm saying, sorry, I got a little off track there for a second. What I'm saying is I don't know what you've been taught, what you haven't been taught. I want to make sure anytime I go anywhere, the first thing I say is if we are being taught something or studying for ourselves, what we have to learn first is that we're studying the whole story. We can't take assumptions and put assumptions in. You get into speculative arguments like who actually sinned first in Adam and Eve. I don't know if y'all have heard this one, but I saw an article the other day that said Adam actually sinned first because he didn't stop Eve from eating the forbidden fruit. I never heard it put that way, but it's an interesting thought. So you can get into those speculative arguments, or you can get into something more literal. Like, why did Jesus stop Peter from attacking the guards when they came together? What was the point of that? That's not rhetorical. Why do you think Jesus didn't? Was it for Peter's sake? Any other idea? Right. Okay. There's 3 or 4 good answers here. But I think the best one is if you go back not very far, what is he telling the apostles, and especially even Peter? What is he telling them leading up to this moment? This has to happen, right? Like, I'm going to die. No, you're not. You're not. No. This is not. It has to happen. I have to die because I have a whole reason that I'm here, and that reason that I'm here requires me dying. And Peter, being Peter, was going to try to stop that from happening. Because Peter wanted what Peter wanted, not what Jesus said he was here for. Okay? So it doesn't take long to think about something like that, a story that we all know and understand, hey, here's the actual reason, here's what's going on here, that makes it a really powerful story. That Peter, with the best of intentions, was doing something wrong, and Jesus stopped him because he had a mission. Not just, it was for Peter's sake, probably. It was because it's not about an earthly kingdom that swords can do anything for. But it's also because the entire reason Jesus came was for what was going to happen if Peter didn't get in the way, which is a really cool parallel for Christians now, right? We have a mission we're supposed to have that Jesus and God gave us, but we get in the way. Even though we know what's supposed to happen, what has to happen, we get in the way. So there's a cool parallel there, but there's also the idea of, after 10 seconds of discussing it, we understand that it's more than just about keeping Peter from being attacked by who knows how many guards that are probably much better trained with the gladius than he was. There's a deeper part of the story that makes it complete. So again, I'm not going to try to claim that I know any part of the Bible any better than any of you. What I do know is I think we've gotten to the point where over years of study, over years of hearing, we have parts of the Bible that we take pieces of that we don't fully understand that are maybe more powerful when we do. I told you, I do a lot of debating. I have a lot of people send me questions, but what's really cool to me, because it's not my strength, is when someone sends me a question like that. Why did Jesus stop Peter? Because my first answer is the practical, logical one. I would say the same thing you did. I'd say, well, because Peter was making a mistake, that he was not going to be able to back that up. Like, no matter how hard Peter fought, he wasn't actually going to be able to stop this from happening. But after thinking about it and saying, no, you know what? It was not long before this that he was telling Peter himself, hey, I'm going to have to die soon. I'm going to have to die, not just for y'all's sake, but for everyone's sake. That made the story more powerful for me and for the person that I sent the answer back to. Studying the whole picture, studying the whole story, taking every aspect of it, even the implications, taking the whole story and putting it together is maybe the beginning of how we start, I won't say doing a better job, but doing the best job we can of reaching the people who don't understand. We have this I don't know what to call it. I hate to say phenomenon because that almost sounds like a good thing, but it's not. But it's just this big thing of how truth doesn't seem to matter anymore, of the whole your truth, my truth thing, or that's true for you, but maybe not for me. Like, I don't know where this came from, but apparently this is a cycle. This is something that comes up every so many years. We see this push away from absolute truth. And the only way I can see for us to start addressing that to people that need to hear the absolute truth is to be able to give them all of it without any of it that we've influenced or changed the way that they're trying to. The most common one I've heard recently is the instruments in worship. I don't know why this has become such a big thing in churches that I used to consider solid churches. But what I see is even when they try to, the members at those congregations will say, hey, this is what I said, and what they said was things like, oh, well, in Ephesians 5 it tells us to sing, so we need to just sing. That's not a biblical, solid argument. What you've got to do is give them all of the reasons that line up to make the necessary conclusion that after I see everything here and every scriptural thing that points to it, whether it's commands, examples, inferences, whatever else, when I take all of these things together, what they equal is just singing with fellow brethren. And that whole picture is what it takes. But I don't think the whole picture is what we do anymore.
I think a lot of that comes down to our humanity side and specifically in our culture, our inability or undesire to accept what we're told to do. We want to justify our own thoughts, our own desires, our own wants by saying, well, you didn't tell me not to. I'm a teacher at the end of the day. You didn't tell me I couldn't do this. No, I told you to do this. That automatically tells you not to do this. No one wants to accept that. They don't want to accept, okay, I was told to do this, this is what I have to do. They want to make excuses to not have to do it. That's where a lot of that comes from.
One of the teenagers that I worked with recently, he used to mow yard. And so I gave him the example of mowing yard. I said, okay, if your mom tells you to mow the yard, and you go out and mow the yard, but you got to put gas in the mower. You're doing something wrong by putting gas in the mower. No, you're still mowing the yard. But if she says mow the yard and you go clean your room instead, your room may have needed cleaned, but is that what you were told to do? No. that was something separate. It's a categorical error. Y'all may have heard that. I don't know what you know, but categorical, it's separate and different, okay? So if you use an example like that, Ralph Gilmore uses similar examples too. He's one of my heroes. He talks about this categorical error of things like songbooks, song leaders, PowerPoints. Those are things that are part of the singing. Something like instruments is not. That's somebody doing something separate that no matter, they use all these buzzwords for it, like it enhances worship or assists worship. The truth is they're doing something different that doesn't actually facilitate the singing part. So when we understand it that way, when we break down, here's what you were told to do, and we don't have the authority to add anything that's separate from that, that's when you can get into, okay, here's the whole truth without the holes in it, the whole truth that's easy to understand, the whole truth that you can explain to somebody that's 100 or 50 or 20 or 10 or whatever, broken down in a way where there's no extra from us to mess up that story. There's no extra from us to keep them from being able to fully understand the story. I'll be honest with that teenager, I know, he kind of acted like he didn't get it, but I think he was just being difficult because that's how his sense of humor worked. But I noticed that afterwards, he stopped asking me about it so much because it was laid out in a way that was as simple as he could understand. And also because you do that and you say, hey, here's the verse that says that baptism is something that has to be done for the remission of sins. Here's what represents death, burial, resurrection. Here's one that says that we have to do it, and here's what baptism means. When you go into the other part of Bible study that's hard for me, you go into language. You say it means immersion. That's broke down for the one in this area that's just like the church. I was like, you can say all you want that the Bible doesn't say we have to be submerged in water, but it does. Why? Because you know that baptismal means immersion. It also can be clothed, completely wrapped. Sometimes in cases of burial wrappings, they would use the same word of so completely shrouded and covered and wrapped up that there was no part of their body showing anymore, which is the idea that we have with baptism. All of that comes from just a little bit of study, and because of that, we can explain it just a little bit easier. So I guess, again, I don't know what you know, but if I'm going to come and speak somewhere potentially just one time, the first thing I'm going to say is we have to make sure that we are studying correctly, without the assumptions, without the influences, and that we are presenting it correctly, whether we have to use maybe some emotional argument, maybe some argument, maybe a little bit of credibility, which we can tie back to the Bible. But in the end, it does have to be the whole objective truth. In any other way is going to mess up not just them, but our influence with them. Gina probably going to be talking about debates. I love debates so much that I got the kids at my last church. I had them doing that in class sometimes, doing the debate stuff. It was fun to watch because they were trying. They were doing a really good job. But you could also tell that they hadn't learned some of this stuff yet. They hadn't learned how to present the argument correctly. So they'd have this. They'd be standing up there, and the other person would explain why baptism was good, and they would start to talk about baptism. Kind of sneak over here, hey Shane, and they'd ask me a question right there in the middle of it. The question would be sometimes really cool. For example, one of the times they were talking about why drinking is wrong, and one of the kids came over and goes, does the Bible even talk about wine? And I was like, yes it does. But then they said, but mine only says fruit of the vine. And I said, great, let's have a class on that. We can talk about this. We can break it down the right way. Because what they've been hearing, especially nowadays, and I hate to say that I've probably been part of this to some degree, is they get used to youth ministers or Bible class teachers that don't know the stuff as well as they could or don't know how to teach it, don't have the experience to teach it. So what they do is they get the same stories over and over. There's a running joke in the youth ministry program at Freed that every youth group has been through the book of Matthew 7 times. Because they get a new youth minister in every year or two, and they just do the same thing. Well, let's start in Matthew. They don't get the whole picture of the Bible. They get one gospel and then whatever else the youth minister moves into after that. And that's probably accurate. That's probably what happens with new preachers sometimes. They come in and they start talking about stuff that you've heard, but they don't know you've heard. I may be doing the same thing now. I hope I'm not. But if I do, if somebody comes in and they say, hey, this is what you need to know about baptism, and we've got to do it. That's not the whole story. If they say, hey, this is baptism. Baptism is about death, burial, resurrection. You come out a new creature. It's still not the whole story. Baptism is complete immersion in water that represents death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have to do it that way. And once we do that, we become a Christian. And once we become a Christian, there is a mission that we are committing to. Is that the whole story? Get closer. I didn't mean that as a trick question. I try to put all of it in there, so I think that's the whole story. But the idea is not only is it a better lesson to give the whole thing, it makes us stronger as Christians to have the whole story with the context, with the scientific applications, historical applications, language applications, whatever it is. Once we have all that, and then we can present it, we still have to present it in the way that people will receive it, which is having to say, hey, here's the logical side of it, but also, it is urgent. But also, not only do you become a Christian when you're baptized, but something the Bible tells us we get access to is His comfort and peace. That gives us some of the emotional side, right? To say that there's a comfort and peace that comes with being a Christian. I don't know about you. I was 12 years old when I was baptized. I don't remember much about it, if I'm being honest. I remember who was there, and I remember that afterwards, it wasn't like I just came out and felt like a completely different body, or I felt like I had a different soul in my body. I didn't have anything crazy. But what I did feel like is there was some kind of peace and comfort and relief in the fact that I had accomplished something that I knew was necessary. There was a peace that comes with being a part of Christ. And it's not wrong to teach that. So if we can balance the way we present these arguments, maybe we can take the logical side, add all these other factors in, and then we have the argument that will not only be complete, but will persuade. Now that Dr. Kirk Brothers is down here at Heritage, y'all may, I don't know if y'all had him speak or if any of you have heard him or whatever, but he was professor at Free while I was there. He was the head of the Youth and Family Program. And it's funny because I don't think we had a single class in any of the subjects he taught where he didn't mention Luke 19:10. That's got to be his favorite verse. All the time he talked about the Son of Man was sent to seek and save the lost. He was sent to save the lost. The Son of Man was sent to save the lost. Over and over we heard that. And something I don't want to get into too much because you might hear something from me later. But the idea that I love behind that is that Jesus' entire mission was not the cross. I hear that all the time. Jesus' mission was the cross. Jesus' mission was to die. But that's not the whole story either. Jesus' mission was to die so that we had access to Him, which is not just more story, but also a better story, right? Something that's more important for us to understand and for others to be able to understand. That He was here to save them all. His mission is us. His mission is us. That's a little more powerful than His mission being just sacrifice, which is something that people did all the time, that sometimes people still do. It's important, but His was bigger. I don't know what time this actually stopped. I don't want to just talk forever. I'm sorry. You said there's a 5-minute warning? Okay. Okay. We'll probably get close to that. Okay, so my next question for you is if there's any story in the Bible that you have questions about, like maybe it's, like I said, I don't know the Old Testament as well as it seems like kids do sometimes, because they'll come in from Vacation Bible School and tell me something I didn't know. But if you have something from the Old Testament that you thought about, have you ever sat down and wondered if everything you know about it is actually what's in there, or if it's just what you were taught however many years ago? Because I 10 years ago, I didn't know the story of Jonah hardly at all. All I knew was that Jonah is somebody who survived being swallowed by a big fish. I didn't know that part of the reason that he ran away from teaching Nineveh is because he decided they didn't deserve it, regardless of what God thought. I didn't know that after he did go to Nineveh, the message he was preaching, God's message, actually did lead to some conversions. Which doesn't just make it a more powerful story, but also gives us another good parallel. I like parallels too. I like that it lines up with what we're supposed to do. I know there's been a few times where there was somebody asking me questions that I honestly assumed either didn't actually want an answer or they were just trying to be combative. They didn't really want the right answer back. They were being combative. And it's hard for me when I feel that way to want to give them a good answer back. When I know that they're asking the question just because they think it's going to be the aha question. I'm going to ask him this, he's not going to have an answer, and then I'll win. When someone has that attitude, it's hard for me to want to teach them. So I think about Jonah. who was in a place where he was surrounded by people that he didn't think deserved to hear the truth. But when they did, they changed the city. Right?
Jesus always had a way of getting around those obstacles. He somehow or another always came underneath it to give them something that they couldn't answer because of their attitude, because of their position. And boy, wouldn't that be a lot of time trying to do that? So the folks who come at us trying to get us in a corner,
Yeah.
give them something that uplifts them instead of trying to give them something that tears us down.
When it comes to taxes, I never would have come up with an answer like whose face is on it. Like that's not how my brain works, right? I'd have got into, hey, does this government defend you? If so, well, they probably need funding to do that. Like that's how cold and practical my mind can be sometimes. But Jesus gave an answer that didn't just stump them, but kind of turned it around on them. Like, where do you go next from there? Hopefully we could do that, and hopefully it would create some thought with them. But I don't know. Right. Which goes back to the credibility of the argument, right? I heard of the logical fallacy, the argument from authority, which is where somebody argues that something is true because they said so, right? Like, I have a PhD in astrophysics, and I say this is true, and because I say it, it's true. That's a fallacy. It's not actually how logic works. But there are arguments of authority that are true. If I tell you that something just happened to me, then I probably know what I'm talking about. The problem is that when you get to other religions, when you get to science even, or history, or some of the more cultural ways of viewing things, you get to where it's all full of stuff from people that don't necessarily have the credibility to make those arguments. And I have no problem admitting to you, I have a problem with the knowing when to cut off part. Like, I just want to keep giving them more and give them more and hoping that'll figure it out, and it doesn't always work that way. So right. Another one, and this goes back to kind of culture and language, is this is one that I'll be honest, a family member sent me just a couple days ago. They said, if God is the only God, then why does the Old Testament call other nations gods? It's a somewhat fair question, but it takes a longer, it sounds bad, but it takes a longer answer than he understands because he's not in the church, so he doesn't have the cultural background, he doesn't know anything about the language, he doesn't know how Jews talk about things. So instead, I've got to figure out the answer that he needs to hear, the way I can explain it that he will understand, which could be as simple as me saying, when you talk about the Norse gods, which he talks about a lot, you don't believe in them, but you still call them that, right? Like that's just a word that describes what they are seen as, not necessarily who they are. There's a difference between that and our God. But I can't do that by talking about Elohim and what Elohim actually means and how that relates to the God versus other nations' supposed gods. Because that's not going to reach him, even if it is objective and logical and it's all of the truth. He needs it in a way that he can understand that will be simple and for him, maybe a little bit of the emotional side of here's how you view things and what you talk about and what you like to talk about. Like, right. But okay, I can give you that. Is that my cutoff? Thank you.